What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. So we're moving on to our next unit, and this is on developmental psychology. So we're going to go from pre-birth all the way through adulthood, the entire lifespan of development. And to do that, we have to start with the big debate in psychology in development between nature and nurture, or genetics and environment. So this is going to be part 1 and 2 of your notes. So it'll be a little bit bigger than we're used to. But that's okay, so we can get through both and knock those out. So we'll start with the genetic influences on behavior. Okay? So as I just mentioned, there's this debate in psych, classic debate. It's been going on forever. What has the biggest influence on our behavior? Is it nature, right? Our genetics, our genes, our DNA, or is it nurture? The way we're raised, the friends we have, the environment we grow up in, things like that. So we'll start with genetics. Okay, and to start with genetics, we have to talk about evolutionary psychology. We touched on this way back in Unit 1. Evolutionary psychologists believe that our behavior and its similarities arise from our biological similarity, right? And they go back to our DNA and our genetics specifically. And they say that mutations, as they occur in our genes, they provide an adaptive edge. And so those mutations or those genes continue to be selected because of that edge that they provide. So this process led to behavioral tendencies and ways of thinking that prepared our ancestors to survive, reproduce, and send their genes into the future. Right? And nature selected those genes that were the fittest at adapting and allowing humans to survive. So from an evolutionary psych perspective, all of our behaviors and our decisions are made based upon preparing ourselves to reproduce and send our genes into the future, and what's going to allow us to do that in the best way. So that they would say that is how we make decisions and how we move through life. So with that in mind, there is some differences between genders and how they behave with that goal in mind, right? So with that goal in mind, males are attracted to younger women, and females are collectively attracted to mature, dominant, and affluent or successful men. Okay, so there's reasons for this that they've shown. They explain these preferences because when women are born, they're born with a finite number of eggs that they're going to have. So they can't waste those things, right, from an evolutionary perspective. But for men, sperm is cheap. So ancestrally speaking, women sent their genes into the future by pairing wisely with men who they think are going to stick around, help raise the children, and men paired widely, right? Because men have the ability to produce sperm throughout the lifespan. So men are naturally drawn to healthy, fertile-appearing women to successfully pass on as much genes as possible, where women are drawn to men who have a capacity to support and protect, and they have staying power, staying potential to help them raise those children that they've produced. Okay? So from an evolutionary perspective, that is the drive for men and women to pass on their genes. So overall, evolutionary psychologists say that nature selects behavioral tendencies that increase the likelihood of sending one's genes into the future. Okay? And I know this is about the third time we've said this, but that is the focus of evolutionary psychology. Okay? Now, there are some critics of this approach, particularly about the fact that it can perpetuate and reinforce gender stereotypes in today's day and age. And people say, we don't need this. That's not necessarily true what these evolutionary psychologists are saying about the preferences of men and women and things like that. And those people would argue that we aren't hardwired, right? Environmental and cultural expectations also have an impact, okay? And that gets back to the debate over nature versus nurture, right? Evolutionary psychs argue for the nature aspect being more heavily influential. But we do know that there are other things, sociocultural factors, that also play a role and can change the preferences of both genders. So that brings us to behavioral genetics. Okay? And this is the study of the relative power and limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. So this approach to psychology gets into the interplay between nature and nurture. Okay? On the nature side, we have evolutionary psych, which we just talked about. On the nurture side, you have sociocultural approach, which we talked about in the first unit. Behavioral genetics bridges that gap. Okay? And they've done some studying, and they use the following things to study the differences between those two, nature and nurture, and the influence between genes and the environment. So they've done identical twin studies, separated identical twin studies, and they've studied adopted children as well to see the interplay between the two. First, we have twin studies. So identical twins develop from a single fertilized egg and are genetically identical. Okay, we also know that as monozygotic, mono meaning one, zygote meaning fertilized egg, right? They develop from one fertilized egg. And you have fraternal twins, and they develop from separate eggs. And they're no more genetically similar than ordinary siblings because they develop from two separate eggs, right? So fraternal or identical twins are always genetically identical. The only thing being different about them is their fingerprints. So they're always going to be the same sex. And fraternal twins can be either sex, and they're not going to look alike like identical twins do because they're not carbon copies of each other. So research in this area has found that identical twins are much more similar, makes sense, than fraternal twins in many ways, such as abilities, personalities, and interests. And as we get into personalities and interests, it gets kind of freaky how closely related or similar identical twins can be. So some of these twin studies that they've continued to do were over separated identical twins, and this shows an even larger connection, greater connection, and reinforces the idea that genes have a large impact in our development. So a guy by the name of Thomas Bouchard, he worked at the University of Minnesota, and he did this Minnesota Twins project. Has nothing to do with baseball, right? Interesting that there's a crossover there. But the Minnesota Twins project started in 1979, and it focused on identical twins who were reared apart or raised apart, separated at birth. And the research is still ongoing, and they've studied over 100 pairs of identical twins that have been separated. And what they've found in their research is that heredity accounted for 64 to 74% of the differences seen in IQ between the different sets of twins, right? So they're talking about a large portion of our intelligence coming from our genetic makeup, which is a large piece of evidence for the side of nature being more significant than nurture, right? In addition, to add more weight to that side of the argument, here is these similarities between two separated twins, Jerry Levy and Mark Newman. Over here, you can see, obviously they're identical twins. When they met, they had the same mustache, same sideburns, wore the same glasses, right? Which is interesting because, what's going to make them want to grow their hair the same way, mustache the same way, same type of glasses? You think that might be environmental impacts. Levy had a degree, a degree in forestry, and Newman instead took a job trimming trees. So very similar job choices. Levy also installed sprinkler systems, and Newman installed fire alarms. So very similar, sprinkler systems putting out fires, fire alarms, triggering sprinkler systems, very similar jobs there as well. Both ended up being volunteer firefighters, and their hobbies included hunting, fishing, watching John Wayne movies, and they love Chinese food, okay? Which is just bizarre to think that all of these things are the same. And they both drink only Budweiser, and they hold the beer can in the identical manner. So this is just pushing even more evidence into the category of nature or genetics and its power over us, because these two men were raised in completely different environments and situations. Now, it's important, if we go back real quick, to recognize that strangers in certain situations, like, if you've met people in school, you realize you have things in common, you have similarities and things like that. So there are similarities between strangers, and that can, tell us that the environment plays a role and things like that, because they would be genetically different. But what the research has shown is that identical twins have more similarities outside the norm than fraternal or even strangers do when they find they have things in common. So moving on to adoption studies, adoptees' personality traits are more similar to their biological parents than their adoptive parents. So there's, again, another check mark in the category of nature. Yet, parents do influence their children's attitudes, values, manners, faiths, and politics. So nature plays a big role, but so does nurture, right? The way your parents raise you, and they instill the different attitudes and beliefs within you. And adoptive children also tend to score higher on intelligence tests than their biological parents. And they tend to be more self-giving and altruistic. So what does that tell us? That tells us there is an interplay with nurture as well, right? If you're being raised in a potentially better environment than the family you would have been given up from, then that's good for you, right? You can develop in a better, more beneficial way. Okay, so this allows us to see what aspects in life are environmentally or culturally determined. Adoption studies specifically, right? Because they're taking them out of their biological home and putting them into a different environment where they're raised. And so then we can really see, what has an impact on which specific situations, the environment or your genes. So our last topic in genetics is something called heritability. And this is something that can be commonly confused by students. So heritability is different from heredity. Okay, separate those two in your mind right now. Okay, so heritability is the extent to which differences in appearance of a trait is due to the difference in genes. Okay, so let's go over this. The more inherited a trait is, the less heritable it is, as heritability looks at how traits are due to the differences in one's gene. And that's across the human population. So we're looking at the cause of the variation in one's genes. Okay. So for example, identical twins have a low, near zero heritability because the variation in their behavior cannot be accounted for by genetic differences. Okay. Because they are carbon copies genetically, right? So their genes are the exact same. So the difference in their behavior must come from their environmental stimuli or their environment. Okay? But the difference between, my personality and yours, we don't share any genetic material. So is highly heritable because we have different genes, right? So the difference in the way that we behave and think is most likely due to our genetic makeup. So that means it's high heritability. Okay. Let's go over another example here. Okay. So heritability increases as environments become more similar. Okay. So as you come from a more similar environment, then the difference in your behavior and mental processes must come from your genes. Okay. So here's an example. If schools were all equal, quality, all families equally loving, and all neighborhoods equally healthy and safe, that means the environments are the exact same. Heritability, or difference due to genes, would increase because difference due to environment would decrease. If you're coming from the same environment, then the differences in you and yourself and the way you express yourself and others must be because your genes are different. Okay? On the opposite side, if we all had similar heredities, if we were all genetically related, but were raised in dramatically different environments, heritability would be much lower because the difference in us would not be because of our genes. It would be because of the different environments that we were raised in, because we all have similar genes. Okay? We're going to do some activities and things in class to go back over heritability. It's a common concept that shows up and one that can be easily confused. Okay, so take some time to review that if you need to. All right, so this brings us to part 2. The environment, right? We just touched on it a little bit in the interplay with behavioral genetics and heritability and how environment and genes work together. It's nature and nurture. It's not just one or the other, but we're going to talk about some specific environmental influences on behavior right now. So this is part 2 of your notes, or notes 9.2. Okay, so environmental influence. Oftentimes we talk about, parents have such a big impact on their children, and they do play a large role in influencing behavior, but they aren't the only environmental influence, right? A lot of times parents get all of the blame or all of the accolades for how their children are turning out. There's a lot to it. So there's things we're going to talk about here individually. Prenatal environment. So environmental influences begin before you're even born. Okay. Experience and brain development, peer influences, culture, and gender all influence the way we turn out in our behavior. Okay. So first up, we have prenatal environment. So nurture begins in the womb before you're even born, right? And how could that be? Okay, well, think about the impacts that your environment can have when you're a fetus and not even born yet. So if your mother takes drugs, if your mother has an illness, excessive amounts of stress, any of those things can influence a developing fetus, right? And that's nothing to do with your genetics. That's all the environment around you. Okay, so any of those things that can impact you while you're developing in the womb, those are teratogens. Right? You might want to write that down, star that. And that's where our prenatal environment comes into play. Those things can impact you. Your environment can impact you before you're even born. Okay. Up next, experience and brain development. Experience helps develop brain's neural connections. Okay. So this is about the environment you grow up in. So they've done some studies. If rats live in an enriched environment, they develop a heavier and thicker brain cortex. Right? If they're more stimulated, they're more engaged, their brain grows stronger, thicker, and more connections. Right? And this seems to hold true for children as well. Infants who are handled more, they gain weight. The human touch is very important. We'll talk about attachment later on. They gain more weight rapidly, and they developed faster neurologically. The more face time is, interestingly, what they call it, that they have. The more touch, the more face time they get with the parents or caregivers. It is a huge benefit neurologically. It helps the brain develop more quickly. If you're not stimulated, though, that maturing brain operates on the use it or lose it principle. So take us back to Unit 3 on biological psych, when we talked about long-term potentiation versus pruning, right? Those connections we use, they strengthen, and the ones we don't, they get cut away, right? And so your brain is always doing that, especially as an infant when you're developing, and that brain is developing very quickly or pruning very quickly, depending on how much of an enriching environment you're being raised in. Next up, we have peer influence. So we have the selection effect. So I want you to think back to, early middle school or grade school when you were choosing your friends, right? Kids, the selection effect tells us that kids choose friends who are similar to themselves, similar beliefs, interests, choices, right? At least similar in those important ways, right? Things you like to do, things you enjoy, hobbies, sports, art, music, all that type of things. If you're interested in those, you choose friends who are also interested in those same things. Now, nature does seem to play a role in the influence of our peers because we are genetically predisposed to liking some of those things or behaving in certain ways, and we choose friends who do the same. Okay, so there's a little bit of nature and nurture involved here. Okay, it is with our peers that we spend most of our time playing, working, and mating. So nature predisposes us to be sensitive to their styles and their opinions. And also, there's a theory out there that, you become a composite of the 5 people that you spend the most time around. Okay, so think about that. Who are the 5 people you spend the most time around? You're becoming a composite personality, or the way you behave is a composite of those 5 people, right? And that's more about your peer influence, who you spend time with, and what you do when you spend time with those people. In addition, parental and peer influence seem to be complementary in shaping our life. Okay? They work together because parents and peers have different influences in different areas. So parents influence our sense of education, discipline, responsibility, orderliness, charitableness, ways of interacting with authority. They're the ones who are supposed to help us grow into adulthood, hopefully in the proper way, and gain these different morals and values. And that works in congruence with peer influence. And they have a little bit more of an influence on our sense of cooperation, our popularity, interaction among others our age, our socialization, you could call those things, right? Your peers have a big role in that. So your parents and peers work together to develop you into the person you become as you grow. Second to last here is culture. Okay, and the basic, obviously, we all know what culture is, but just to review, it's the behaviors, ideas, attitudes, and traditions shared by a large group. Okay. Cultures differ, right, which in turn cause us as human beings to differ. We know there's different cultures around the world, and so human beings behave and think in different ways as a result of those cultures. Each culture has their own cultural norms, and those are rules for accepted and expected behavior. Right? Different norms can often confuse us, right? When you go to a different country, or even if you go from the southern United States to the western to the northern United States, these different cultural norms can be confusing because we're not used to it. We don't know how to behave in those situations. Okay, so for example, there's personal space. In the United States, we really like our personal space, stay out of our bubble. But in some European countries, they'll kiss each other on the cheek as a greeting, right? And they invade that personal zone. It's not as important to them, okay? Levels of expressiveness. We express our emotions, thoughts, and feelings. We talked about this in our emotion discussion last unit and how different cultures express their emotions more freely and others are expected to be more stoic, especially in public. Those are different cultural norms. And our pace of life, right? In the United States, and it is all go, 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 work hard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be everywhere on time, that type of thing. Where in other parts of the world, if you're late to a meeting, it's okay. You have things going on in life. Some countries take naps in the middle of the day. That's siesta idea. So there's different ways in which cultures and societies expect people to behave and perform. So we'll look at a couple other scenarios when cultural norms may cause some confusion. Okay. So a couple big ones here. There are child rearing differences between a collectivist and individualistic culture. And here's an example. Okay, so individualism is what you experience in primarily Western cultures, right? They want their kids to think for themselves, be independent, be true to yourself, set your own personal goals, right? The individual before the society is an individualistic culture, right? Very much United States. It's on you, worry about yourself. But then you have, in opposition to that, collectivism. And many Asian and African cultures, they have communal cultures that emphasize family, honor, dignity, neighborhood, community before yourself, right? If you shame yourself, you shame your family. So there's pressure there. But there's a greater concern for social harmony. And so they tend to be more shy with strangers. They tend to defer to others because they consider the collective before they consider themselves, okay? So there are these differences that exist between cultures, but there's also a lot of similarities within cultures because in the end, we are all human and we have these similar human wants, needs, and drives that we go through as well. So culture can have a big impact. It also changes over time, okay? Some changes can be positive, like what we're going through right now, email, air travel, more independence for women. And some are negative, right? As over time, we've seen higher divorce rates in the United States, higher suicide rates, higher crime rates, things like that. So if you think about now versus the 1940s, 50s, 60s, culture's changed quite a bit in terms of expectations for women, men, gender stereotyping, right? Things like that, technology. So culture changes and that can change the way that we interact and behave as well. There's this idea of memes. And it's not the meme you're thinking about. It's actually a psychological term called memes, but they're self-replicating ideas about fashion, inventions, and habits that are passed from person to person, okay? And they compete to get copied. The faster, the better. Can be good, bad, or neutral, right? So things that are kind of like cultural norms or pop culture, those can be considered memes. So if you think of some of the memes of the past year or two, or even the last 5 or 6 years, the way you dress, leggings, crop tops, man buns, all of those type of things, AirPods, right? These fashion ideas or inventions that everybody wants to have, this self-replicating idea of we need this, we need that, right? Those are cultural memes that also impact our behavior as well. Right, so our last topic, gender. All right, so naturally, genders differ genetically, right? That's a genetic fact, and that's where we start. Okay, so genders are different in terms of X versus Y chromosomes. Okay, so single production of different hormones. Okay, they signal production of different hormones, right? A male, genetically male, has an X and a Y chromosome. Genetically female has XX, right? So when you produce a new human being, the male either gives an X or a Y, and it will become a genetic female or male from that situation. Now, we know the genetics of gender, right? But gender is also socially determined. There are things called gender roles, expectations about the way men and women behave. These have changed drastically as our cultural expectations have changed over time in the United States, right? Gender roles are the expectations. They vary across culture as well. That would change greatly depending on the area of the world that you're in. Then you have gender identity, and this is your own sense of being male or female, okay? How you identify yourself, right? So we have gender roles, societal expectations. Gender identity is your own sense and how you identify. And then you have gender typing, right? And this is how we acquire masculine or feminine roles or characteristics, okay? And this is what you do to learn in order to be masculine or feminine. And this comes from society, can be shared with our gender roles. Gender typing you pick up throughout development and throughout life, and that will tell you, what does a typical male or typical female do? How do they behave, right? So those are our three categories of gender: gender roles, gender identity, and gender typing, right? Some of those traditional gender roles you can see here, we all know what the very traditional, original gender roles in the United States were. You can take a look through them, but classic stereotyped things. Males are expected to be leaders, independent, take control, make decisions. Females, shy, passive, nurturing, dependent. They're supposed to take care of the children. Men go out and be the breadwinner. All of those 1950s and 60s traditional gender roles, right? Those are changing, right, as culture changes. So who knows what these traditional gender roles may be in the next couple decades. Now, gender theory explains some of these ideas. Right? So we have social learning theory. Children learn gender-linked behaviors by observing and imitating, as well as through rewards and punishments. So we're talking about observational learning, vicarious learning, learning through watching others and seeing them being rewarded or punished, or your own operant conditioning, right? Does your behavior receive reward and reinforcement or punishment, okay? And it's not necessarily all based on the messages that children get from their parents, okay? Because research has shown that even if parents discourage traditional gender roles and they don't teach their children traditional male and female ideas, they often organize themselves into girls and boy roles. Now, why is that, right? Your parents could try as hard as they want to prevent that from happening, but your children go out into society, into the culture, and they pick those things up, whether it's from their peers, from school, from the environment and the areas they spend outside of home, right? That's naturally going to happen, and that's been shown to happen. So social learning theory is how we pick those things up, right? And who we see and how we learn them. Okay. Now, building upon that is gender schema theory, right? This is social learning theory plus the aspect of cognition or thinking about what you're seeing or picking up from others. So children learn from their culture a concept of what it means to be male and female, and they adjust their behavior accordingly, okay? So social learning theory, you see these things happening, and you learn that way. But gender schema theory, you see these things happening and you think about them and you say, oh, I'm a male, this is how I should behave. Or I am female, this is how I should behave. And that's gender schema theory. You build that schema in your brain, that interpretation and that organized information on how males and females are supposed to act and interact. Okay, so you kind of compare yourself with your concept of gender. For example, boys might not do a sewing project at summer camp because they perceive that as a girly thing, right? Maybe they've socially learned and seen only women sewing or things like that. So they think about that and they say, oh, that is a female thing to do, right? So I'm not going to do that. Gender schema theory just adds that layer of cognition onto social learning theory. Okay. So that's how we kind of build things. Our environment has a major impact on us, and so does our genetics, right? So it's not just nature or nurture, it's both. And the interplay between the two has a very large impact on our behavior and mental processes and the way that we develop as people. So we'll get more into this in class. We'll give you some examples, and we'll go from there, right? Let me know if you have any questions.